Days before the banquet, Meghan had already been warned that the procession order would not be changed. But the explanation only deepened her anger. Behind polite palace language, she believed she could hear something colder, a message that Camilla's rise required Meghan's public submission, whether she agreed or not. The warning came during a series of private planning discussions in which nothing was considered too small to control. Seating positions, entrances, titles, jewels, speaking order, even the distance between members of the family were examined with almost ruthless precision. To palace officials, these arrangements protected the dignity of the crown. To Meghan, they appeared to decide who mattered, who belonged, and who was expected to remain quietly behind. She saw the banquet as more than a formal evening. It was a rare opportunity to prove that, despite her distance from official royal life, she had not disappeared from the monarchy's story. Her representatives therefore asked for one significant change: Meghan and Harry should enter separately as a couple rather than following Camilla in the established formation. The request was presented as a way to avoid tension, but palace advisors immediately understood its deeper meaning. They rejected it. Their explanation was controlled and direct. The procession had been arranged around the monarch and Queen Camilla, and changing one position would weaken the entire order. Yet Meghan did not simply object to walking behind Camilla. She feared the image itself. One photograph could define her reduced status more powerfully than any official statement. Once the world saw her following Camilla, the palace hierarchy would appear settled, permanent, and beyond challenge. Harry understood that fear. He knew how easily royal images became historical judgments. But he also knew that pushing further would provoke senior courtiers. And Anne. He tried to support Meghan without turning the disagreement into open rebellion, though every conversation pulled him deeper between his wife's pain and the institution that had shaped his entire life. Anne had already issued her own private warning. Officials, she insisted, must not reward threatened non-compliance by changing tradition at the last moment. In her view, once personal resistance could interrupt ceremony, every future event would become vulnerable to pressure. Camilla was informed of Meghan's objection, but chose not to approach her. That silence was meant to avoid escalation. Meghan interpreted it differently. To her, Camilla's refusal to engage felt like calculated superiority. The confidence of someone who knew the palace would enforce her position without requiring her to defend it. The final message left no space for negotiation. The order was fixed, attendance was optional, and the subject was closed. Meghan attended anyway. She believed that when officials faced the possibility of a humiliating public standoff, they would bend rather than risk chaos. But Anne had understood that calculation from the beginning. She arrived prepared to ensure that ceremony would continue, even if someone refused to take their place. By the time the royal cars arrived, everyone knew the order, but only Anne seemed prepared for what would happen when Meghan openly defied it. For several unbearable seconds, nobody moved. Aides waited for Meghan. Harry whispered urgently. Camilla did not turn around. Then, Anne made her decision. Without seeking approval, she crossed the space Meghan had refused to occupy and walked forward, delivering a silent royal judgment more brutal than any public rebuke. The pause was brief, but inside a ceremony built on perfect timing, it felt dangerously long. Every step had been rehearsed. Every position had been fixed. Even the smallest delay threatened to expose the conflict the palace had worked so hard to contain. Meghan remained still, while the people around her waited for a movement that did not come. Harry leaned closer and urged her to continue. His words were quiet, but the pressure behind them was unmistakable. He knew that guests were already watching the entrance, and that cameras would soon notice the broken formation. One more second could turn private resistance into a public crisis. Meghan did not answer. She believed the palace would finally be forced to acknowledge her objection. If she held her ground, Camilla might stop. An advisor might intervene. The order might be changed. For the first time that evening, she felt she possessed real leverage. Anne saw something entirely different. To her, this was no longer a disagreement over pride or position. It was a direct threat to the functioning of the crown. The procession could not remain frozen while one person waited for the institution to surrender. So Anne moved. She stepped into the space Meghan had rejected and followed Camilla forward. Sophie and the others continued behind her, restoring movement almost instantly. There was no announcement, no argument, and no visible command, yet the meaning was devastating. By taking Meghan's place, Anne made it appear that Meghan had not been excluded at all. She had simply surrendered her position. Camilla continued without turning around. Her calm protected the ceremony, but she understood the severity of what had happened. Meghan's refusal was an insult to the order built around her, and Anne's intervention had made that insult impossible to hide. Meghan felt the balance shift. The leverage she believed she held vanished the moment the procession continued without her. Anne had denied her the confrontation she expected and replaced it with something colder: irrelevance. Harry then stepped out of his own position to remain beside Meghan. His loyalty was immediate, but it widened the breach and drew even more attention. An aide approached and quietly offered them a separate entrance. It was not a reward or compromise. It was containment. Meghan saw humiliation. Officials saw the only remaining path to prevent further disorder. Ahead of them, Anne entered the banquet hall, knowing the confrontation had not ended. It had merely changed location. Anne had restored the procession, but inside the banquet hall, every chair, glance, and jewel carried the power to reopen the conflict. When Meghan finally entered, the banquet had already moved on without her. The music continued. The guests remained composed, and Anne sat perfectly still. But beneath the polished ceremony, a new struggle had begun, because Meghan's place at the table now seemed to confirm everything she had tried to resist. Meghan and Harry entered after the main royal formation, separated from the carefully arranged center of power. Nothing was announced, yet the difference was impossible to ignore. They were present, but they were no longer part of the entrance that defined the evening. To Meghan, it felt less like an adjustment and more like a public demotion. Then she saw her seat. It was farther from Camilla and the monarch than she had expected, positioned among guests whose presence carried respect but little influence over the royal household. The arrangement had officially been approved weeks earlier, but after what had happened at the doorway, Meghan could not believe it was innocent. She suspected Anne had known exactly where she would be placed and had allowed the seating plan to deliver the next blow. Every gesture now seemed deliberate. One guest greeted Meghan warmly, while another offered only a brief nod. Several continued speaking as she approached, creating the uncomfortable impression that her arrival had changed nothing. Courtesy remained, but closeness had vanished. The room was calm. The message was not. The jewels deepened that message. Camilla wore a historic piece linked to rank, authority, and royal continuity. It did more than decorate her. It confirmed her position at the center of the institution Meghan had just challenged. Anne's choice was quieter, but equally powerful. Her jewel was connected not to glamour, but to years of duty and service. Meghan understood the symbolism immediately. Anne did not need to defend her place with words. Everything she wore seemed to say that status inside the monarchy was earned through discipline, loyalty, and endurance. That struck a deeper wound. Meghan had privately requested access to another royal jewel for the banquet, one she believed would reflect her own place in royal history. The request had been denied because of security concerns and restrictions tied to her status. To officials, it was procedure. To Meghan, it was another example of tradition being used to make her smaller. Harry grew increasingly frustrated. Conversations around them remained polite, but emotionally distant. Nobody openly confronted them, and that made the isolation even sharper. Anne refused to discuss the entrance incident, denying Meghan both the argument and the acknowledgement she expected. Then Camilla rose to deliver the formal toast. She spoke of unity, duty, and respect for institutions. The words were broad enough to sound ceremonial, but Meghan heard something personal beneath them. She believed the message was aimed directly at her. In that moment, she decided silence was no longer protection. It would only allow Anne's version of the evening to become the official one. But before Meghan could challenge Anne privately, a message began circulating through the palace that made the entrance dispute far more dangerous. Before dessert was served, senior aides were already writing down what had happened. Times, positions, warnings, and witnesses were quietly recorded. Meghan believed the incident was a family disagreement. The palace saw something else entirely, a deliberate disruption that could determine whether she would ever be trusted at a state occasion again. Inside the royal household, serious disturbances were never allowed to remain as private memories. Security officers and protocol teams routinely documented anything that disrupted movement, altered a planned arrangement, or created uncertainty during a major state event. What had happened at the entrance met every one of those conditions. Meghan's refusal had delayed the procession, forced Anne to intervene, and pushed Harry out of his assigned position. By the time the banquet was underway, those details were already becoming part of an internal record. The first question was simple, but dangerous. Had Meghan reacted in the moment, or had she planned the confrontation in advance? Some advisors argued that wounded pride had taken control at the doorway. Others believed the refusal had been calculated. Then, one aide gave an account that changed the tone completely. According to the report, Meghan had suggested before the event that palace officials would change the order once they realized she would not move. That single claim carried enormous weight. It suggested that the standoff had not been an emotional response to sudden humiliation. It may have been designed to create pressure at the exact moment when the palace had the least room to resist. Anne demanded a full written account. She did not ask for punishment, but her meaning was unmistakable. Future ceremonies could not be planned around the possibility that someone might use public embarrassment to force a last-minute concession. To Anne, this was about protecting the crown from becoming vulnerable to personal ultimatums. When Harry learned about the report, his anger was immediate. He accused officials of turning an emotional disagreement into something almost criminal. Meghan had felt degraded, he argued, yet the palace was recording her pain as misconduct. Camilla's response was more cautious. She did not call for sanctions, but neither would she support removing or softening any detail. The official record, she insisted, had to remain complete. Meghan understood the danger. Such a report could influence invitations to future banquets, coronation events, memorials, and formal processions. She demanded that her version also be included, that the original arrangement had been intentionally degrading, and that her objections had been dismissed. Officials refused. Protocol, they argued, could not be described as personal hostility simply because it caused offense. Then the report revealed something even more troubling. The entrance incident was linked to an earlier dispute over Meghan's place beside Camilla and her denied access to a historic royal jewel. Suddenly, the refusal no longer appeared isolated. It looked like the final eruption of a conflict the palace had been documenting for months. And at the center of that earlier conflict was not merely a procession place, but a forbidden jewel Meghan believed had been promised to her. The entrance dispute had begun with rank, but its deepest wound was locked inside the royal vault. Meghan had requested a jewel she believed represented acceptance, independence, and historical importance. Instead, access was denied, and the final decision had passed through Camilla's household, turning disappointment into something far more personal. The piece at the center of the dispute was a historic royal jewel long associated with women who had entered the monarchy from outside its traditional aristocratic world. To Meghan, it carried a meaning far greater than beauty. Wearing it at the banquet would have signaled survival. It would have shown that distance, criticism, and years of conflict had not erased her place in royal history. But the jewel did not belong to any one person. It remained crown property, protected by rules that placed its use under strict palace control. Every request required approval, and Meghan's application moved slowly through layers of review. At first, she was told the matter was still being considered. Then came questions about security, relevance, and whether a non-working royal should be allowed to wear such an important piece at a state event. Finally, the answer arrived. No, Camilla's household supported the refusal, arguing that state jewels should represent official duty, not private emotion. Meghan heard something harsher. She believed Camilla was deciding not only who walked ahead of her, but which parts of royal history she was permitted to claim. Harry challenged the logic. Other women who had married into the family had worn historic pieces, he argued. Why should those jewels now become symbols of exclusion? To him, denying Meghan access appeared less like procedure and more like punishment disguised as tradition. Anne's position was even harder. Royal jewels, she insisted, were not emotional compensation. They could not be demanded as proof of respect, acceptance, or status. In Anne's mind, such pieces represented service to the institution. They were earned through discipline, obedience, and years of public duty. That difference cut to the heart of the conflict. Meghan believed identity came from what she had endured and what she had sacrificed. Anne believed it came from what a person continued to give. The refusal changed the meaning of the procession order. Being told to walk behind Camilla no longer felt like a single ceremonial instruction. It became part of a larger pattern in which authority, access, and symbolism were all controlled by the same inner circle. Meghan briefly considered wearing a privately owned piece linked controversially to Diana. Advisors warned that the choice could be seen as a deliberate provocation, turning the banquet into a battle over memory as well as rank. She backed away from the jewel, but not from the confrontation. She chose restraint in one arena and resistance in another. Then she learned the final detail: Anne had personally advised against releasing the historic piece. In that moment, the doorway standoff no longer felt accidental. The woman who had stepped past Meghan had already helped close the vault against her. Once Meghan learned Anne had opposed the jewel request, the banquet entrance no longer looked like a misunderstanding, it looked like the latest move in a hidden campaign. After the final guests departed, Meghan asked to speak with Anne alone. She wanted an explanation for the jewel, the procession, and the public humiliation. What followed was not a shouting match. It was colder, sharper, and more devastating, a confrontation between two women who defined loyalty in completely opposite ways. Harry remained nearby, close enough to intervene, but deliberately left outside the first exchange. Meghan wanted Anne to answer without the protection of courtiers, protocol officers, or carefully controlled palace language. She accused her of stepping forward to embarrass her before the household and international guests, turning a private objection into a public defeat. Anne did not retreat. "The ceremony," she said, could not be frozen, because one person refused an assigned place. Her decision had not been personal, it had been necessary. That answer only sharpened Meghan's anger. She argued that royal protocol had repeatedly been used to make her feel inferior while shielding senior figures from the same level of judgment. Rules were called sacred when they limited her, she said, but suddenly became flexible when someone more powerful required protection. Anne rejected the accusation. The hierarchy had existed long before Meghan entered the family, and it could not be rewritten every time it caused discomfort. To Anne, the crown survived because individuals accepted limits. To Meghan, those limits had become weapons. Then the jewel entered the argument. Meghan demanded to know why Anne had advised against releasing it. Anne answered with brutal clarity. Crown jewels were not rewards for marriage, fame, or public sympathy. They represented active service, accountability, and trust. A person could not step away from royal duty and still expect unrestricted access to its most powerful symbols. Meghan accused Anne of applying that principle selectively while overlooking the failures of senior royals. Anne admitted the institution was imperfect, but imperfection, she argued, did not justify deliberate disruption. Meghan's refusal had weakened the ceremony, embarrassed the household, and placed Harry in an impossible position. At that, the voices rose, and Harry entered. He defended Meghan, but he also understood how close the confrontation had come to total collapse. He blamed Camilla's elevated position for creating a hierarchy his mother would never have accepted. The name changed the atmosphere instantly. Anne's reply was controlled, but devastating. Diana's memory, she said, could not be used to settle every modern dispute. Harry reacted with fury. Meghan heard something even deeper, a dismissal of the pain she believed had shaped both their lives, yet Anne refused to soften her warning. The entrance refusal would have consequences far beyond one evening. Inside the monarchy, trust was not restored by explanation alone, and once it disappeared, access, influence, and belonging could vanish with it. By morning, Anne's warning had become reality as the palace began deciding whether Meghan and Harry could be included in future royal ceremonies at all. The next morning, the argument was no longer about who walked behind whom. Senior officials met to discuss future invitations, ceremonial access, security, and the risk of another confrontation. Meghan had challenged Camilla's position, but the palace responded by tightening the very system she had tried to resist. The first recommendation was severe. Meghan and Harry could still be invited to certain family occasions, but they should no longer be included in processions that required absolute precision. They would attend as relatives, not as central members of the royal formation. On paper, the distinction sounded technical. In reality, it carried the weight of exile. Camilla was careful not to appear vindictive. She resisted any decision that could be described as personal revenge, yet she privately accepted that the order of future ceremonies had to be protected. Another public refusal would not simply embarrass her. It would expose the monarchy as unable to control its own most important events. Anne demanded written confirmation that no guest, regardless of title or bloodline, could negotiate rank at the doorway. Her position was uncompromising. Once ceremony became vulnerable to last-minute pressure, the crown would lose control of the very symbols that gave it authority. Harry saw the move differently. To him, the palace had been waiting for an excuse to push them farther away. The banquet had provided it. Meghan agreed, arguing that accepting reduced access would validate the humiliation she had protested in the first place. The wider family was divided. Some believed Anne had saved the evening by acting quickly. Others feared her intervention had made the conflict more personal and more dangerous. What might have remained a private dispute had now become a struggle over belonging. For Harry, the consequences reached beyond himself. He worried that exclusion from royal ceremonies would weaken his children's connection to their inheritance and history. Palace advisors answered with a colder distinction. Family blood and titles did not guarantee institutional privilege. Access to crown property, state occasions, jewels, and processions depended on trust and active duty. The internal report would remain on file. It could influence planning for future funerals, jubilees, weddings, and banquets. Every invitation would now carry a question. Could Meghan and Harry be trusted to follow the agreed order? Meghan began considering a public explanation, one that would present her refusal not as defiance, but as resistance to an unfair and emotionally damaging system. Harry feared that releasing private details would end whatever relationship remained with his father. Then came the final development. Meghan still possessed messages sent before the banquet. Messages she believed proved the palace knew exactly how strongly she objected and chose to proceed anyway. Those messages gave Meghan the weapon she had been searching for, but using them could destroy the last fragile connection between Harry and the crown. The palace believed the crisis had been contained. The procession continued, the banquet ended, and official photographs revealed nothing. But Meghan still had the private messages, Harry still carried the insult, and Anne had made one thing unmistakably clear: the next act of defiance would not be treated as a misunderstanding. What happened at the banquet could no longer be dismissed as a brief disagreement over ceremonial order. It had become a turning point. The monarchy had continued without Meghan, Anne had protected the formation, and Camilla had emerged with her authority publicly untouched. Yet beneath that appearance of control, the conflict had only grown more dangerous. Meghan studied the messages exchanged before the event. They documented her objections, the repeated warnings, and the palace's refusal to alter the entrance arrangement. The messages did not prove that officials had intended to humiliate her, but they confirmed something almost as damaging. The palace knew a confrontation was possible and still chose not to compromise. That left Meghan with a painful decision. Releasing the messages could support her claim that she had been ignored and pushed into an emotionally impossible position. But doing so would expose private royal communications, destroy more trust, and possibly close every remaining door. Harry was trapped between two losses. Defending Meghan's reputation might require him to challenge his family publicly once again. Remaining silent might preserve a narrow path back to his father, but it would leave Meghan carrying the blame alone. Meanwhile, Camilla's position had grown stronger. The ceremony had continued after Anne stepped forward, proving that the institution could survive Meghan's refusal without altering its order. Anne had become something even more significant, the person willing to enforce royal continuity when everyone else hesitated. Some courtiers admired that strength. Others feared it. Anne's uncompromising response, they warned, might push Harry and Meghan toward a far more damaging disclosure. The denied jewel, the procession order, and the internal report now represented the same struggle. Who owned royal identity? Who decided which family member could display its symbols, claim its history, or stand within its most powerful ceremonies? Meghan refused to apologize. Moving forward, she believed, would have meant accepting a diminished role chosen by people who had never understood her pain. Anne also refused to retreat. Duty, she insisted, could not wait for personal agreement. Camilla knew she had been protected, but she also understood that Meghan's anger would remain focused on her position. And as the next major royal gathering approached, one question became impossible to silence. Would Meghan release the messages before the family stood together again? Anne restored the order for one night. But by moving forward without warning, She may have started a conflict the monarchy could no longer contain behind closed doors. Because the next time those royal doors open, the world will not only be watching who walks first, it will be waiting to see who refuses to follow.